Either you're tied together as this collection of knots, which is what it is to be alive, or the body is dissolved. So the fragility of those knots is really important in how the Iliad thinks about the body.
Welcome to Lesche, a podcast on new ideas in ancient Greek studies. I'm your host, Johanna Hanning, and I'm a classicist at Brown University. These days, few classicists are a household name, but Emily Wilson is one of them. Her translations of the Odyssey and the Iliad have gone an immeasurably long way toward bringing Homer back into the popular culture and engaging a new generation of readers. When Wilson's Iliad first appeared a little over a year ago, I was asked by Slate to review it, and here I want to rehearse just a little bit of what I wrote in that review. There, I noted that, despite the popularity of the Odyssey today, it's only rather recently that the Odyssey overtook the Iliad as Homer's most famous poem. Ancient critics seem to have agreed on both the priority and the superiority of the Iliad. In Plato's dialogue Hippias Minor, Socrates says that he prefers the Iliad on the grounds that its star, Achilles, is a manlier man than the hero of the Odyssey. And Socrates was far from alone in his preference. In antiquity, the Iliad was by far the more common text for study in schools, and the known ancient papyri that preserved lines of the Iliad outnumber those of the Odyssey by a ratio of 3-1. In his treatise on the Sublime, the author known to us as Longinus has much to say about Homer, and about the different feelings of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Here, I'd like to read a little bit from chapter 9 of that treatise in GMA Group's translation. So, Longinus observes that Homer's stories of wounds, factions, revenge, tears, chains, and confused passions among the gods make the men of the Trojan War, as far as possible, into gods, and the gods into men. Our lives of misfortune find a haven from ills and death. And later in that chapter, Longinus goes on to compare the Homeric voice of the Iliad and of the Odyssey in his own sublime terms. He writes, "One might compare the Homer of the Odyssey to the setting sun. The grandeur remains, but not the intensity." And a little later, "The Odyssey is like an ocean that has withdrawn into itself, into the solitude of its own boundaries. Greatness ebbs and flows as the poet wanders into the mythical and the incredible." So for Longinus, then, the Odyssey paints a colorful but less blinding canvas. The Iliad, on the other hand, displays Homer's powers in the full blaze of day. Those powers, with all of their dazzling intensity, are beautifully rendered in English by Emily Wilson in her new translation of the Iliad, which it was my absolute pleasure to discuss with her for this episode. Emily is not only a gifted translator, she's also an expert communicator, and she's done an immense amount to make her translations accessible and to pull back the curtain on her work as both a translator and scholar of the Homeric poems. I felt hugely lucky that she agreed to come onto the podcast and discuss with me the finer points of her readings of Homer, and, in particular, of the Greek of the Iliad. Emily Wilson is department chair and professor of classical studies at the University of Pennsylvania, where she holds the College for Women, class of 1963, term professorship in the Humanities. Wilson attended Oxford University, where she earned a BA in Classics and an M.Phil in Renaissance English Literature, and Yale University, where she took her Ph.D. in Classics and Comparative Literature. She has been named a Fellow of the American Academy in Rome in Renaissance and Early Modern Scholarship, as well as a MacArthur Fellow and a Guggenheim Fellow. Just a quick note that, as ever, I've put a few references in the show notes for this episode. So now I'd like to welcome into the Lesche Emily Wilson, acclaimed translator of Homer's Iliad. The next voice you'll be hearing is hers.
So when I signed up to do the Odyssey, in my contract, I had the clause, which of course the publishers insisted on, that if I was going to do the Iliad, I would, do it with Norton. And so I knew that if the Odyssey seemed to be successful, that they would ask me to do the Iliad. And I had thought maybe I'll do it, but maybe I'll, leave it 10 years in between, because it seemed like it would be kind of a lot to do them back to back. And then, of course, they did want me to do them back to back, and they sort of pressured me to do it. And I thought, actually maybe I'm never going to be in a better position to do the Iliad than I am now, because I've already sort of warmed up for it by doing the Odyssey, and I've figured out some things about how I wanted to do it. And then once I did agree to do it, I realized, I kind of have to start from scratch. And both because the poems are actually very different, even though, of course, they're so complementary, but they are so different in mood and tone, and the whole setting is completely different. And then I realized after a few months of working on the Iliad that I couldn't do the line-for-line thing, that I'd confined myself to the same number of lines with the Odyssey, and I realized I couldn't do that with the Iliad. And it took me a long time to let go of that, because I thought pacing is so important, and part of what I want to do is both the metricality and rhythm, but also pacing. And then once I let go of that, I felt it was a kind of breakthrough, and I realized actually I can do more with, I can get to closer in terms of what I want to do, in terms of the voice and the feel of the poem, if I let myself just have a few more syllables. And then just trying around with drafts and drafts. I mean, it was also, in the first few months of working on it, I felt I was constantly coming up against the problem, which I was throughout, of how to make sure it sounds intense enough without sounding melodramatic. And I mean, especially in the first choral sequences, which I worked on to start with, my first drafts would either sound flat and not intense enough, or they would sound like I'm trying to make it sound funny, which of course I wasn't. And it can be funny, but it has to be really painful first. So those kinds of things in the initial stages.
Well, could I ask a little bit about your initial choice to start with the Odyssey? What was it that led you to begin with what most people think of as, the second poem?
Yes, I mean, obviously, in a way, it is the second poem. Just in terms of the narrative, it's the second poem, and who knows exactly about composition, but maybe it's the second poem in terms of composition. It was the publishers primarily, because I was already working on the Norton Anthology of World Literature, and a lot of the reason that Norton wanted a new Odyssey translation was because we had the whole Odyssey in the anthology. So they were looking for a new translation of the Odyssey, not necessarily of the Iliad, primarily because the Iliad was only appeared in the anthology in extracts, the abridged form of the poem, which cuts out the bits that aren't about Achilles, which I think is a shame, but that's still the way that we have it in the anthology. I have made very futile attempts to suggest that we could flip it around and have the whole Iliad and have an abridged Odyssey, but that's just never going to work, because the teachers who teach the Odyssey in 9th grade and all the instructors all across the United States, especially, who teach a survey of ancient literature, they're much more likely to teach the whole Odyssey than to teach the whole Iliad. So from the publisher's perspective, the Odyssey was the one that seemed to have much more market value than the Iliad.
You were mentioning that, and I guess it's obvious in certain ways, but that these are very different poems. So I suppose I'm curious about what it was like to sit down at the desk with like a blinking cursor and a blank document and begin translating the Iliad and looking at the Greek. What were your first impressions about whether similarity or difference between the two poems when you first kind of confronted the Iliad? Was there any point at which you were like, oh my gosh, maybe this is going to be too much, or maybe this was what was the feeling of it when you first approached it?
It was more daunting than I thought, because of course it wasn't the first time I'd been thinking about the Iliad and the Odyssey, and I've read them and taught them a lot and reread them, for decades. So it wasn't, I thought I already had my thoughts about all of that. And yet somehow the process of producing a complete translation is totally different from just preparing for class or just thinking about it by myself, reading it without feeling now I'm responsible for this whole recreating whatever the experience of this is for somebody who isn't looking at the Greek, which is a huge responsibility. And also then setting up for whatever the classroom experience is for everyone who might use this translation. In the initial stages, in general, I don't look at the cursor, I look at the notebook, which I find less intimidating, because then writing by hand, you can cross it out, and then you can cross it out again and cross it out again. And then you can also then realize, actually, the thing I had 10 crossings out ago was actually better. So it's for the early drafts, I find it much more useful to use a notebook and a pen than to use the computer, because otherwise I cross out things that I then want to go back to and it's too late.
Could you say a little bit more about your translation process? The notebook point is really interesting, but yeah, what does it look like when you work?
So I do a lot of just rereading just a little chunk of the text. Not too much at once because I need to be able to sort of hold it in my head. I read the commentaries, I look words up in the dictionary and figure out where else is that word used. Is that something I want to think about? Are there things I can learn about connotations by looking up where else is that word used, or where is that line repeated elsewhere in Homer? Because of course that's very often a question. And then I go back and maybe read it out loud, and then I try and do a first draft by hand. And then very often I find I do a lot of crossing out. And I was surprised that with the Odyssey, I would feel I was stuck, and it took me, a couple of years to do the first couple of books. And I thought with the Iliad, now that I've practiced, I won't have that. But in fact, it was exactly the same. That I was very, very, very slow for the first couple of books, and it took me 2 or 3 years to do the first couple of books. And then once I got them, once I got that done, then I would do it much, much faster. Once the voice was clear, it was much easier.
So you mentioned earlier about kind of threading that needle between with the early books, and with the choral in particular at the beginning, of having it not be melodramatic and sort of not silly. How would you, I guess, describe what it was when you found the voice?
I find that very difficult to answer, right? Because, if so much of it is looking for something which you can't describe. And then once you've got it, then it's the it that it is, rather than something you can describe abstractly. I felt that that combination of being very intense and yet taking it all very seriously is really important. And yet there were also moments of comedy in the Iliad, so I didn't want it to be sort of ponderously serious. And there's sort of similar impossible binary of it needs to sound or it needs to feel emotionally intense, and yet it also needs to feel strange. That there needs to be both an intimacy where you can feel how these characters feel, and yet the way they express their feelings, even the way they feel their feelings, is different from how we feel our feelings, because they have a thumos and they are slapping their thighs and weeping and wailing and ripping out their hair and rolling around in dung in ways that most people, even when they're very upset, don't do in the 21st century. So those questions about how strange or how familiar am I making it, it's difficult to sort of talk about that in the abstract. I felt it had to be worked out in a line-by-line, passage-by-passage-way. I felt that I had sort of some guiding principles about it. I came towards thinking I need to really prioritize metaphors, even when they're strange metaphors, and that would be a way of conveying the strangeness of the vision of the poem, even beyond the social customs being strange, that the whole idea about how does sleep wrap around the body, or how does anger enter into the body, that I could treat those images as if they're not even images, as if they're just describing something concrete about how is the poem imagining rage or grief as these semi-concrete physical things.
I was wondering too, because I think there are a few people out there who have worked as intently, even among classicists, with these poems as you have. Classicists all sort of, the idea is that, you just somehow, if you're classicist, you of course know these poems, but you've really sat down and worked through them, picked through them word by word, both of them. Mm-hmm. How would you characterize, I guess, and really in very abstract terms, just the feel of the Greek of the Iliad as composed to the feel of the Greek of the Odyssey?
Again, it's a difficult question, right? There are things that are easy to chart, like some of the vocabulary is different, but then that's partly because so much of it happens on the battlefield as opposed to happening out at sea. So there are particular kinds of words that you don't get in one poem versus the other. And of course, there's Monroe's rule, where things that occur in one poem don't tend to occur in the other, in terms of the mythological landscape. I mean, I was just on the level of figuring out how to translate the Iliad. The number of words for different kinds of noises, both human noises and metal against metal kinds of noises, are so much more in the Iliad. So that's one of the sort of linguistic features, is just how noisy it is as a linguistic landscape. How many of the lines are about evoking a particular sound. And that's very difficult because it's hard not to make that sound cartoonish in English.
Well, the soundscape was precisely one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, because I remember when you came here, however many years ago it was, and spoke to, were invited by the graduate students here. I remember you were talking about the challenge of rendering that din of battle.
Yeah.
In particular. Could you just say a little bit more about that? And maybe about the soundscape of the Iliad as compared to, like, thinking back on it, the soundscape of the Odyssey?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's hard to talk about this in the abstract. I feel like it's both a very good question and a question I do not find it easy to answer. I mean, I feel that in general, finding sounds that are patterned and marked in some way, even if the sound isn't the same sound. I mean, that if there are a lot of sigmas in the Greek, or if there's a lot of sibilants, then maybe I can do something which is going to have a lot of sibilants, but maybe the sibilants will be in a different place. Or if there are a lot of long vowel sounds, maybe I can do that in the course of the sentence or the passage, even if the long vowel sounds aren't going to be in the same words exactly. Those kinds of questions about if it sounds noisy, or if there are a lot of spondies in this line, or if there are a lot of dactyls and it sounds as if it's speeding up, are there ways I can use the English language to create something like that feel of speed or slowness or intensity or noisiness or alliterativeness, even if it's not, obviously it's not going to be the same sound, but it can be making noticeable sounds. Yeah.
Well, it's just incredible how many skills undertaking something like this involves. I mean, between doing all of the philological work and then all of the you being a very good writer work, it's really a lot. I was wondering, because I remember reading your review of Karen Emmerich's book in the Journal of Modern Greek Studies, her book on literary translation and the making of originals, where she discusses how the process of translation in a way, creates our ideas of what the original texts really were and how can be very complicated. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how you approach these questions of what parts of the Iliad are athetized, what lines are moved around, because someone, I think, who is not reading in the original Greek, they approach your text, and as with any translation, mm-hmm. they don't know, they wouldn't know the kind of decisions about mm-hmm. just the constitution of the text that went into it. So mm-hmm. could you maybe speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such a fascinating question. And of course, given that I had, only 6 years to do this, I couldn't do a sort of complete re-edition or complete, there were times when I felt I would kind of like to spend another 6 months digging into this line and figuring out what would I want to do with it if I was doing a new edition of the text, but I couldn't do that. So of course I was, relying on the commentaries, relying on the modern editions, but then there were also times when I would sometimes think, actually, I do want to go with a different reading so I guess an example that's just right at the start is, as listeners probably know, there's the alternative ancient reading of the question of whether it at the start, when the bodies the people who are dead as a result of the menace of Achilles, are they feasted on by the dogs and oionoisi te pasi, or are they oionoisi te daita? And the OCT prints Parsi, which I think is the less interesting reading. And I tend to think that in order to fit also with the imagery of the dogs who are getting war booty from the, they're getting heloria, which suggests this anthropomorphizing of the dogs. Why don't the birds get anthropomorphized too? They do if it's Daita, because they get a banquet. Whereas if they're just all the birds, it's kind of boring and it doesn't follow the metaphor. So I went with I went with Daita as opposed to with Parsi, and I have an endnote at the back about it. So there were several cases like that where I thought I can use the endnotes to explain this is why I've done that, and this is why even though I mostly am following the OCT, I'm not going to all the time follow the OCT because there are times when I don't prefer what the reading is that's in that text.
Well, I think that the apparatus of the book is something that really just makes it useful for everybody. So for everybody from people who know Greek and are maybe teaching it or just, reading it for their own pleasure, which I think, fewer people confess to doing than should, or just even for people approaching it for the very first time. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about how you went about the introduction, because the introduction is really full. It's incredibly helpful. But that too must have been really daunting. I mean, how do you say
it was very daunting, yes, and actually say everything about the Iliad. I mean, I'm glad they let me have as many words as they did. I mean, there are some translations which have much shorter introductions than this does, and I think it was, especially with the Iliad as opposed to the Odyssey, because the text itself of the Iliad is longer, and I let myself have more lines, and then they let me have more endnotes, and then I still had a really long introduction. So it was a lot of pages. I was daunted by it. I mean, it took me a long time, and I did the Iliad. I did the introduction and the translator's note at the end of the process rather than at the beginning. So that I was already very, very primed with lots and lots of thoughts about the Iliad, and it was very difficult to sort of get all the thoughts down to however many words was the limit of what they were going to be able to print. I mean, I went through multiple drafts and I did a lot of, moving things around and trying to figure out how do I condense all these themes that I want to have into a reasonable number of sections. Yeah, it was difficult, and it was a challenging kind of work because it has to be a different voice from the voice of the translator's note, of course, a different voice from the voice of the translation itself. But it also has to be not too daunting for the general reader. So, I mean, the publishers very much didn't want lots of footnotes to all the books about Homer that I know about and have read. So it has to be having absorbed some current discourse in Homeric studies, but not footnoting everything, which is a difficult kind of writing to do.
I think it's incredibly difficult. And I just was really arrested, I guess, by the first paragraph, which I think just of the introduction, which says with incredible clarity that this is the story of two stories that are interwoven, the story of Achilles' wrath and of Hector. And I think that just the writing there, it was one of those things that even if you've read this poem however many times, it's put so clearly, and I felt like there was a lot of work of that first paragraph that is concealed.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's difficult to do. Obviously, in a way, the introduction does some of the Wikipedia-ish work, right? Of you need to know some basic stuff about the Homeric question and the plot of the poem and the structure and how exactly the poetics works. But you need to do it in a voice that isn't at all Wikipedia-ish. And so getting to, you're conveying some factoids, but they have to sound as if they're in a very different genre from that.
Yeah, I mean, you say there are these two different storylines, and then the last two sentences of that first paragraph are, the two storylines are resolved together when Achilles allows the dead Hector to be brought back to his people to be mourned. The struggles of many others, men, women, goddesses, and gods, are woven into the same grand tapestry. I mean, it's two sentences, but it's the poem so clearly, and I feel like it just, I don't know, in some ways it made me look at, oh, that is, and these are these two lines, and they come together, and that's how, it's more the coming together of the resolutions of those two stories than just the end of Achilles' wrath, as I guess I'd been used to thinking of it.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, this is also just getting back to how I said a few minutes ago how in the Norton Anthology is the way many people read the Iliad of just focusing on Achilles. And I think it's a misreading of the poem if you don't see that both of those narratives are together all the time. It's all together. I mean, I think I could have framed it in terms of three because, of course, it's also Zeus and Hera, but that would have messed up the paragraph because it's too many braids.
The paragraph is so nicely balanced.
Yes.
Well, I think one of my favorite parts of the introduction or subsections is the one on the mortal body, And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about what you discussed there. You begin that section by saying, at the center of the Iliad is the mortal human body. Mm-hmm. And I was also curious about, to return back to the kind of earlier line of questioning, to what extent or in what ways the Iliad's preoccupation with the mortal body is different from similar preoccupations in the Odyssey.
Yeah, I think it's extremely different. I mean, I think the way that the Odyssey is constantly, I mean, it's interested, the Odyssey is interested in the body as well, but it's interested in the body in ways that have to do, of course, with eating and being eaten, which is a physical thing. But it's the question of which bodies are the eaters, which are the eaten, and also of how bodies get transformed and therefore get to survive. And eating, of course, is part of that, of the transformation of bodies into other bodies, which is not the way that the Iliad thinks about the mortal body. The Iliad body is sort of always on the point of lucis, of dissolution of some kind or other, and of being pierced. And so this sort of focus not on you transform and then you're going to be another body and or you transform it back into the original body, which Odysseus can do repeatedly, or you can transform into somebody else's body if you're an animal or a human who gets eaten by a goddess or another human, or Cyclops or whatever it might be. That never happens in the world of the Iliad in quite that way. It's that either you're tied together as this collection of knots, which is what it is to be alive, or the body is dissolved. And so the fragility of those knots is really important in how the Iliad thinks about the body. And also the way the body in the Iliad is always having to be supplemented with the very expensive high-tech machinery of the armor.
Could you say a little bit more about, I mean, well, I think that this focus on the mortal body, it's not those questions around embodiment, and also the last point that you just made, the machines of the armor. I mean, even thinking about that technology within the Iliad in those kinds of terms, I think is not the sort of usual thing that you see, at least in the standard established resources for working with this poem. They're certainly appearing in more recent scholarship, but as you were working through the commentaries and the various apparatus around the poem, were there other points that stood out to you as like, oh, this is something that is important to the poem, that is kind of being left not picked up as much as it might be by the established scholarly tradition?
I mean, I think, as you're sort of suggesting, I think the current scholarly tradition is moving towards much more recognition of how fascinating the Iliad's representation of matter and the material world and the body is, including the non-human material world as well. I mean, I think eco-critical approaches to Homer and to the Iliad in particular are on the rise for a reason, that it really is very striking how the poem presents so much of the non-human world as it were alive, and it has such a deep interest in landscape and what do humans do to it, and what do humans do to the plain, to the rivers, the ways that the animals in the poem are also part of the part of the whole narrative, and they have their own voices and wishes within the human violence. So I mean, I think there are sort of ways that both new kinds of gender studies, new kinds of new materialisms, new eco-critical approaches are just responding to things that are there in the poem and bring those things to light. And that for me as a translator, just making sure that I'm really paying attention to how does this poem represent the material world in ways that might be sort of surprising, and that I'm not going to just import a Cartesian body-soul thing onto the poem if that's not what's there. I'm instead going to be really observant about the ways that its approach to nature and matter are weird and fascinating.
By the time that you got to the end of your work translating the poem, I'm curious about what you might have changed your mind about, as opposed to, the ideas that you had about the poem before you really dove into the translation. Did you change your mind about any of the characters, or maybe some of that, what is important, what is not?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's always hard to reconstruct like the past self. I feel like I have a terrible memory about that. I don't know what I thought at the start. If I didn't write it down, I don't know. I mean, I think I remember that and I'm not sure if I still thought this by the time I was starting on the Iliad translation, but I know that, when I was first reading the poem, years and years ago, I, like many people, had a very negative idea of Agamemnon and sort of thought, obviously, he's presented as a both egotistical and constantly in denial about his own responsibilities in ways that are not supposed to be likable. No responsible, respectable leader will constantly be blaming everything he screws up onto Ater and Zeus, and that we're constantly shown how Agamemnon is messing up and can never own his own mess ups. And I don't think that anymore. I think that's one strand in it, but I think that's also part of how the poem presents the vulnerability of all of the most powerful characters. And so in that way, I don't think Agamemnon is as different as I originally thought from Hector or Achilles. I mean, I think that question of how to have a public face and how to hold on to a public face when inevitably, if you're a leader making decisions, the decisions will often have bad consequences, as is the case for all of the leaders who make decisions in the poem. So Agamemnon is less different from the others than I think I thought years ago.
I always wondered about Agamemnon, too, because the ancient tradition is so clear. I mean, he is this wonderful king. He is a respected king. And I, wonder, I guess, if maybe in the Iliad, he just got a bad edit. It was just, like they say in reality TVs. But I was wondering, did you, looking really closely at, in working so closely with the figures of Hector and Achilles in particular, and in being faced with the challenge of, rendering the Greek into your own language, the Greek that accounts for them and accounts for who they are. By the end, where did you land on your maybe appraisals of Achilles and Hector?
I mean, it's hard to sum those things up, right? Yeah. I mean, I think the poem presents them both with enormous sympathy, and also, I mean, I think sometimes people say, I really like Hector, and they sort of present it as, this is my original take on the Iliad. I think Hector's actually the good guy, and the real hero of the Iliad is Hector. And I tend to think that's kind of sentimentalizing and not sort of facing up to the ways that Hector and Achilles are parallel, and that they both have, in a way, a similar kind of challenge about the impetus to gain their own kleos, which means destroying the people they love, or leaving in a way that destroys the people they love, or leaving the people they love to be destroyed or to die. And so the parallels between Hector and Achilles really stand out more clearly to me now than I think they did 10 years ago. The ways that they are actually the sentence you picked out of the introduction of the double narrative braided together, I don't think it says much about contrast as it is about parallel, even though, of course, it is both.
Well, speaking of the ways in which Hector and Achilles leave the people they love, I was hoping that we could take a look at a passage.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
It's such a fan favorite, that meeting between Hector and Andromache at the Skyan Gates in Book 6. And I was hoping that you might read a little bit of your translation of that encounter.
Sure, yes. So Hector has done his famous wish that Astyanax will grow up to be an even better warrior than his father and bring bloody arms back to his mother. With these words, he gave his son to his beloved wife. She let him snuggle in her perfumed dress, and tearfully she smiled. Her husband noticed and pitied her. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Strange woman, come on now. You must not be too sad on my account. No man can send me to the house of Hades before my time. No man can get away from destiny, first set for us at birth, however cowardly or brave he is. Go home and do the things you have to do. Work on your loom and spindle and instruct the slaves to do their household work as well. War is a task for men, for every man born here in Troy, but most especially me." When he had finished speaking, glorious Hector picked up his helmet with its horse-haired plume. His loving wife set off for home, but kept twisting and turning back to look at him. More and more tears kept flooding down her face. Quickly she reached the rich and well-built house of Hector, killer of men, and there she found a multitude of women slaves inside. She prompted all of them to start lamenting, and so they grieved in his own house for Hector while he was still alive. They knew that he would never come back home again from war. He would not get away from fierce Greek hands.
Thank you. So for this passage, which is, like you said, everybody has the unique realization that Hector seems like a nice guy or whatever. Everybody has that sort of process of the, unique realization for themselves that this is a really great passage. Mm-hmm. Could you say a little bit maybe about some of the choices that you made? I have to say I absolutely love snuggling.
Yes, snuggling. Let's talk about the snuggling. Yes,
I would love to talk about snuggling.
so snuggling. Predictably enough, there were words in Homeric Greek which are extremely, extremely difficult to translate in any way that's going to be at all convincing. One of which is kolpos, which suggests a fold. It can be a fold in the upper garment. It can be a lap. It can be a bay. It can be the cleavage. It can be like the crotch. It can be a body part, or it can be a dress part, or it can be a natural landscape part. And it has connotations of enfolding in a way that's comforting. And so I sort of struggled with, am I going to, they seem to be standing up, right? The husband and wife and the enslaved nurse are standing up together, so I can't use lap because if they're not sitting down, then the baby isn't on a lap. Do I use something like breast or bosom? If I have a fragrant bosom, it's going to really throw the whole linguistic register off. And it's also kind of creepy, right? It's like, well, whose point of view is it? Who's going to be sniffing her like that? And I also sort of wrestled with the way that of course, the poem sets up so clearly the parallelism between the goodbyes that Hector has with his family in book 6 and then the goodbyes that he has with his family in book 22. And of course, in book 22, also very famously, Hecuba shows her actual breast, which is a mastos and not a kolpos. So if I use something that sounds like breast, it's going to sound like there's this sort of trope of Hector and the breasts. And I actually don't think that that's what's going on. I think it really matters that it's a kolpos, not a breast. So I think sort of philologically, it's much more likely that what's being suggested is the fold of the upper garment as opposed to the body inside. So I wanted to sort of convey that it's the dress, but I also wanted to convey there's something enfolding and comforting about this word, right? The connotations of it, it's like a harbor. It's like something that encloses the child when he needs a cuddle. So I thought even if I'm transferring some of the connotations of kolpos onto the verb, dexter also suggests comfort, but it suggests it more in conjunction with kolpo, it seems to me. So I felt it was justified to use snuggle to make it clear this is the child's perspective, and the child's perspective is needing the comfort from the dress and from the mother.
Well, I think also then in the next line with that famous juxtaposition of she's weeping, but she's also laughing. I mean, it's clear that they've let their guard down. I mean, they're not, formal on show for the rest of the city or the kingdom. That's exactly, you would snuggle.
You would snuggle, yes. You would snuggle the baby, yes.
Circumstances, yes. What else?
And that oxymoron is also difficult. I mean, I made what is dacroen, I made it an adverb because I just felt there's no way to make it sound fluent and in the way that the original sounds fluent. Of course, there's a sort of endless problem about what to do with Greek participles. Because you can't have as many participles in English as you can in Greek.
Right. Were there other particular points that you remember, nodes in that passage that
I think we could sort of spend several hours combing through every line. I mean, so another obvious problem is what to do with daimoniere. Hector and Andromache both use that word for each other, and there's comparably in the Odyssey, Odysseus and Penelope in an equally climactic marital scene use that word for each other. And of course, it's cognate with daimon, so there's a whole lot of discourse in the commentaries and in the dictionaries about the degree to which that connotation or that etymology is present in the word. I mean, does it mean something to do with a spirit? Or is there a daimon touching this person? Does it mean you're acting so out of character that a daimon must be running through you? Or does it, as sometimes you look it up, and some of the dictionaries sometimes say it just means some word of affection and has nothing to do with the etymology, which I actually find a little unpersuasive, because the only evidence for that is something like this scene, which doesn't seem to me necessarily to prove that both the husband and the wife don't think there is something weird or maybe daimonic, not demonic, but there might be a daimon at play in this scene. So I use strange in both cases. I mean, both in what Andromache talking to Hector and Hector talking to Andromache. I played around with weird for a while, but I felt that it's sort of, the register wasn't quite right. And then I also played around with, should I just have them just call each other darling? But I felt that's actually losing something, because it's much more ambiguous than darling would be, or dear, or some kind of affectionate word.
Do you remember what you did with it in the Odyssey?
I did extraordinary in the Odyssey. And I thought about doing that here too. And then I thought part of the joy of getting to do it again is I can do something different. I can try out a different possibility. But I felt a sort of similar kind of thing of I want to lean into the possibility that the husband and wife are expressing a kind of alienation at a moment of intimacy, and that there's a kind of surprise that could be there in suggesting somebody is touched by a daimon. So another I talked already about participles. Entropalis dominaire, very, very difficult word. That's another. I have twisting and turning back, and I really struggled with, is there a way to do it all in one word? And I don't think there is in English. And then similarly, thalaros, I think, is an extremely difficult word to translate, because of course it connotes. It is used of blooming plant life and also of healthy people, but also of an abundance of anything. And there isn't a word in English that suggests all of those things. And so I just did more and more, because I think it suggests the idea of something's coming that's coming more and more, in the way that a plant could be growing and growing faster and faster. Again, it's not exactly the same as the original, but it's trying to convey something about the energy of the original.
Well, I think that's so much it, isn't it? Is what you said is the conveying the energy of the original. Mm-hmm. Do you have, I hate to keep kind of harping on this. I asked you about the Greek earlier, but I guess I'm thinking about when, I teach the Iliad and the Odyssey, and we talk about this question about, is this just, was the rupture with the Trojan War so cataclysmic and just final that we are talking not just about different stories, but about different worlds between these two poems? How would you say, to what extent is the energy of the Iliad just different?
I don't think it is as different as that. I think the Odyssey ends up in a place that's really very close to where the Iliad is, right? The Odyssey is sort of starting somewhere very different, but moving closer and closer towards the world of the Iliad. So, Book 22 is the Iliad inside an oikos, which is in some ways even scarier than the Iliad outside an oikos. The battlefield sequence happening inside the house, and then the battlefield sequence happening at the very end of the Odyssey in Ithaca. I don't think it's a totally different world. I think there are lots of parallels between this conversation and Odysseus and Penelope's conversations. Right. I don't think it is. Obviously, I'm not going to say it's not different, but I don't think it's a complete rupture.
You mentioned earlier similes. What was your sense walking away from the Iliad of its use of similes? And I won't even ask compared to the Odyssey at this point. What is your sense of their cadence? What is your sense of just sort of the way that they're working en masse within the poem?
I'm not sure if I have a good answer to that beyond just I have a ever renewed sense of just how amazingly great they are. I love the similes so much; they're so good. Maybe even more in the Iliad than the Odyssey, because the Iliad is so intense in its primary narrative, and then the simile very often ratchets up the intensity, and at the same time as taking you somewhere else. And the capacity of the poem to do that, to do both, that we have this very, very intense primary narrative, and then we're going to go to some completely different scene, which will be totally vivid in its details and in our sense of how does it feel to be this lion, or to be this storm wind, or to be this tree or this wave. And yet it's also it doesn't detract, it doesn't make you sort of think we're going on a meandering thing and what were we talking about again. You can understand the ways that the Lion and Achilles are the same as well as being so different. I just have an appreciation of, I'm not sure that I feel like when we're coming up with monograph topics, you're not really supposed to say, I just really like them, but I do really like them. I think they're great.
I think you've earned the ability to just say that.
Like them, yes.
It's a simile in a way, or it's a simile for a line, but maybe we could look at the passage that you had mentioned earlier in Book 22 with the chase between Achilles and Hector. If you would maybe be willing to read this, would you count this as a simile? I mean, we have as in a dream.
I think so. I think it's a simile. Yes. I mean, I think it's an extremely weird simile. I mean, there are a few similes that are not at all typical, and this is maybe the most famous, very atypical simile. And I mean, that's also something that the Iliad does, right? That at these moments that are extremely climactic, it's able to do something that you might think the tradition couldn't do. Like, how can this be? Most of the similes are not nearly as abstract as this. Usually there's animals and nature, and yet this is not about animals and nature. It's not about the external world at all. It's about the world of dreams. And yet it's assuming that we all know that, just as we would know storms and sheep. And it's kind of extraordinary, right? I mean, it sort of makes you realize there is a continuity between Homer and Heraclitus, as well as between Homer and Herodotus or whatever else.
So that the listener knows, we're talking about Book 22, the passage that begins at 199 in the Greek. Emily, could you maybe just set up for listeners what's going on here?
Yes, so this is in the very climactic sequence in which we've been building up to pretty much since the beginning of the poem. Certainly since Achilles has returned to the battle after the death of Patroclus. Patroclus has been killed. Patroclus, Achilles' dearest friend, has been killed by Hector, and Achilles' wrath has mutated into fury against the Trojans and desire to kill and desecrate the body of Hector. So he's been chasing Hector, and this is climactic moment in the chase of swift-footed Achilles and Hector, who manages for far longer than you would think possible, far longer even than the narrator thinks possible, been managing to get away to extend the... We know how important this sequence is because it lasts so long in terms of the narrative and in terms of the temporality that then it seems like it should last. And so in a way that the simile also speaks to that narrative question of why does this last so long? How can this be sort of frozen in time, even though it's also so fast?
Would you mind reading the passage?
As in a dream, the chase goes on forever. You never catch, you never get away. So ran Achilles, always just behind, feet pounding but unable to catch up, and Hector was unable to escape. But how could Hector ever have evaded impending death unless he had encountered Apollo for the last and final time?
So could you speak a little bit about your approach to this passage, or maybe why it was a challenging one?
It was a challenging one, partly because of participles again, because the Greek, as everyone knows, uses participle as the subject of the infinitive. We don't use that construction, like fleeing to chase. I can't use something like that and be understood. And then also the syntax by which we understand there are two, like there's the one, hoton, us ho, diokein. So do I use as in a dream when one person, do I say one? Do I say when there's one man who blah, 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 and then I've totally lost the pacing. And then when there's another person who blah, blah, blah. But then that loses both the pacing and also loses what I think is there in the original, a sense that you're already in it before you know what it is, that it's really fast. And you also understand that this is a dream where you might be flipping between the point of view of the person running and the person running after the person running ahead. And I played around with dozens of ways of doing that, and then I sort of for a long time I thought there must be a way to do it with one, when one does this and the other does that, And I just felt that it was constantly throwing it off because it would very often sound as if I was using the sort of posh, well, one doesn't really like to run away, but one has to run away sometimes, even if one is a brave warrior. And that wasn't the right vibe for the intensity of either the moment or those lines. So I flipped it to you, which I think I was saying before that I wasn't sure if I liked it, but I think it's better than any of the other options that I could come up with, in that it does convey the directness, which I think is there in the original, that you are confusingly in this very intense situation, just as you very often are if you're dreaming asleep, and that the perspective is both Achilles and Hector, and that we understand as listeners that we're both. And that we understand that in a dreamlike way before we sort of come out of that, in coming out of the simile.
Well, I think that, and I'll just say it again, so you have there, as in a dream, the chase goes on forever, you never catch, you never get away. I mean, it's just so masterfully done, I think, but again, concealing so much thought and so much work. And I think if you had one, it would, you could easily imagine someone sort of tripping up on that.
You can trip. Everything I tried, it made me trip when I would read it out loud. And then similarly, the other syntactical thing that I do in those two lines of having the chase, which is an abstract noun, as opposed to the Greek doesn't have that, right? It has the participle with the infinitive instead. And again, I tried a whole lot of other possible verbal ways of doing it, and I felt the only way to do it is to move it to a noun, which is an active noun, and then it makes it clear that there's this overall thing of the chase, which is there in the juxtaposition of fugonta and diokein in the Greek, but isn't summed up in quite that way by an abstract word. But then, of course, modern English goes for abstract nouns in places where Homeric Greek doesn't.
As much as we, remind students or remind ourselves about Greek's use of these unusual for us constructions, all of the participles, the subject accusers with infinitives and so on. You have to kind of remember that it also doesn't work the opposite way. Yeah. Which I think that in the translationese, people preserve it, works going in the opposite direction, but it doesn't work.
And in fact, it doesn't work. I mean, if you want to make it sound like the original, you do have to use different syntax, I think, at least in cases like this.
What's your take on the way that the Iliad, your Iliad, Wilson's Iliad, has been received so far? It's just out in paperback as of very recently, and so it's had a little bit of time. How has it been going?
I was very grateful for your review. You did it was very nice of you. I feel really grateful that I got really great coverage, and people seem to be actually reading it too. I mean, one thing that really pleased me was how many people, so both that Autumn MacDonald did the audiobook, did an amazing job with it and really sort of performs it, and that it won an audiobook reward. And I feel like I've heard of lots of people, going on long car rides and listening to the Iliad. And I just love that. It makes me so happy. It's great. I feel very, very happy that it's not just being treated as a text that people have to read in college because their professor makes them read it, but that there are, grown-ups who are choosing to read it or listen to it, which is great. The more Homer that's out there in the culture, the better.
Yeah, it's been great. I'm actually leading a group at the Providence Athenaeum.
I love that. Yes, there was one at the Philadelphia Athenaeum too. Yes.
Oh yeah.
yes. All the Athenaea all across the country are doing it.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah. They're reading
it's
groups.
Really cool.
From everywhere from the Athenaea, I guess, to we were talking about the New York Times articles.
Yeah,
it's
lovely.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, if you don't mind my asking, what's next for you?
I'm doing a shorter translation project. I'm doing the Heroides, which is really fun and a very different voice from Homer, but of course, in some ways the same world, but it's really fun. And working on couplets is a totally different technical challenge. It's very fun. And then also this sort of similar but different question about how to make sure the voices sound distinct from each other. And then I'm also doing a retelling of the Trojan War myths that are sort of in the background to Homer, but as a sequence of short stories.
Oh,
I haven't done that kind of writing in public before, and I'm having a great time doing it. I started off doing it sort of thinking I'm going to be bold and make a lot of stuff up, and then sometimes I get bogged down in thinking, oh gosh, there are 3 different versions of this myth, and how do I get the timelines to match up? And yeah, it's difficult, but it's really fun.
That's really exciting.
Yes.
Do you miss the Homer, though? I mean,
I do.
It was so many
Yes.
years, and it must be so much work.
Many years. In fact, I think they're going to let me do this. I'm actually doing a revised version of the Odyssey. So I don't ever want to not be doing Homer. I'm just going to keep on revising them until I'm dead.
Oh my goodness. Well, that's exciting. That's I think that one of the things that has been so great about the way that you have done these poems, the way that you have translated, is that you've let so many people in onto the process and onto the thought process and into thinking about translation as something that's not the last word.
It's not the last word. I've gone through dozens of drafts of every passage, and what I've arrived at isn't definitive in any way. It's one of the possible ways of doing it, and there are always dozens more ways of doing it.
Well, I think it's so great, too, for people to hear that even for you, maybe you want to do it a different way at a different moment or in a...
Absolutely, yes. I mean, it'd be great to do it in hexameter one day, once I figure out how to do that, which I haven't yet, but maybe one day. Yeah.
Well, so if you don't mind, I like to wind down with a little game. It's just a word association game. Okay. So I would just say, I have a few words written down that I would then ask you just to say whatever comes to mind. But given the nature of the book we've just discussed and the conversation, I was hoping you might do this word association in the persona of Achilles.
Okay, I'll try. Yes. I mean, I suppose I have to think about which stage of Achilles' story arc am I in, but I'll see what the words are to figure out.
Okay.
That. Yes. Right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first one is Patroclus.
My head, my life, myself.
Helen.
Singing the songs of Troy. I mean, they have so much in common in terms of they're both having the perspective on the whole story. But is that what he would say? I'm not sure. Yes.
Because in my mind, I was toying with, might he just say who?
Yes, right. I mean, he doesn't tend to have much to say about any woman, right?
Right. Troy.
The last walls, right? I mean, that he's already sacked all of the others. It's the last one.
Oh, that's great. King Priam.
Let me tell you a long lecture about what I've learned, old man.
And the last word is war.
The source of grief and glory.
Well, thank you so much, Emily. Thank you so much for doing the podcast and for all of the not only for the translations, which are so wonderful, but also, again, for, like I was saying, all of the public work that you've done to engage people, to really make people active readers and sort of participants in this conversation. I think it's been so good for the field, and we owe a lot of new and incoming classics students to you and to your work. So thank you for quite a lot.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to talk to you.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Lesche podcast. And special thanks for their support of the podcast to Brown University's Department of Classical Studies and the John Carter Brown Center for Advanced Study. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. We look forward to you joining us again soon here in the Lesche.